Good morning, Connecting Point. Hey, today I'm going to interrupt our study of the book of Romans, and for the next 4 weeks I am going to do a study on the book of Esther. Now this is a very unusual biblical book, as there's no mention of Israel's God. There are many questionable actions in this book, but it is devoid of the usual commentary regarding ethics of the choices made. There are no miracles or prayers. The only practice that could be seen as religious would be a call to fasting. Actually, it's not even fasting and prayer, it's just fasting. And that was shortly after the Jews got some really bad news. So many people on both sides, the Jews and the Christians, have often debated whether this book should even be included in the canon. Yet here it is. So we'll just pretend that it belongs there. So, because of its lack of reference to Yahweh, it's very difficult to present this book verse by verse and draw out theology. Now I'm going to look at it more thematically and hope to show how this all fits in with the rest of Scripture. I have a few themes that I will present over the next few weeks. I intend to draw out the concepts of providence, the true intentions of our enemies, the true intentions of God's plans for our enemies, and finally how God intends for us to live in His kingdom and the role we play in those plans. So the book of Esther is set at the end of the exile. A remnant has been allowed to return to Jerusalem to reclaim the land for God's people. The first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra tells of the return and of the construction of the temple. Now due to criticism and discouragement and threats, the construction of the temple actually took 22 years after they came back. The book of Esther starts about 30 years after the temple is finished, and it will still be another 25 years before Ezra returns and starts his reforms. And his reforms insist on the obedience to the law of God. Then Nehemiah returns another 5 years after that. So that's where we are in the grand story here. So I'm going to start reading the story. I plan to read as much as I can of the book over the next few weeks. I will have to skip over a few verses to fit it all in, but we won't miss too many details. If you want, read these books at home or read these chapters at home and get very familiar with the story. I would love to hear what you think about it, and yeah, when you read it, I'm sure you'll hear different things than what I've heard. So here we go. This is chapter 1. So this is what happened during the time of Ahasuerus. The Ahasuerus ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Ahasuerus reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet, lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink, with no restrictions, for the king had instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women at the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. So, our book starts off with an introduction to King Ahasuerus, or as the Greeks knew him, King Xerxes. They had been the dominant empire since they defeated Babylon, with hardly even a fight 50 years earlier. Now this was the first true empire in history. To give you an idea of its size, Israel's kingdom maxed out at about 37,000 square kilometers. That's slightly larger than Vancouver Island. Persia, on the other hand, maxed out at 5.5 million square kilometers. That's roughly the size of the 10 Canadian provinces. The area stretched from today's Pakistan to the Balkan Peninsula, down into Egypt and Ethiopia. Now this is an amazing feat considering papyrus and horses are their most advanced technologies. Now this was achieved with a policy that let all displaced people return to their homeland with self-rule. As a result, the nations were loyal and returned the favor with tributes and armies that were ready to fight for the Persians. So the feasts that are mentioned here coincide with the historical war council that Xerxes had prior to going to war with Greece. He wanted to know he had the support of his satraps, and he put on a big show of his wealth. Now Xerxes used the display of his wealth to entice his subjects into the war. This wealth was offered to the army generals as a reward for the most successful armies. So let's read a little bit more here. So verse 10. On the seventh day, when King Ahasuerus was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Since it was customary for the king to consult with the experts in matter of the law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king, the 7 nobles of Persia, who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Ahasuerus that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Ahasuerus. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed, throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The kings and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. So this book explains the origins of the Jewish celebration of Purim. Every year when the Jews celebrate Purim, the book is read out as part of the festivities. People dress up as clowns, give out gifts, and hold parades. There is a joy surrounding this yearly event. With good reason, Israel is celebrating the fact that the genocide planned for them was interrupted. As the story progresses, Esther presents a few unique features that are not seen in other books of the Bible. First, there is a lot of humor in this book. Now this is recognized as deliberate and a tool to help with the celebrations. We know that there have been many funny Jewish comedians, especially in the 20th century. Now one of those comedians once said, I laugh in a joke, because if I don't, I'm going to cry. So he was referring to the plight and history of his people, and it has been a very difficult existence for them. So this comedic tradition may have started here. I don't know if I couldn't find anyone that confirmed that, but this may be where it started. So admittedly, some of this humor is hard for us to see due to our distance from this culture. For example, King Ahasuerus in Hebrew sounds a lot like King Headache. This name is not found anywhere else in the books of history. It is unique to Esther. It would be like someone today calling our esteemed Prime Minister Trudeau or Trudeau. And everyone that doesn't like him will laugh and snicker at the irreverence. Not that I know anyone like that. But you can see the disrespect they have for him, King Xerxes that is. Because King Ahasuerus is a bit of a tongue twister for myself, I'm going to call him Xerxes from now on. Thank you. We also see a little humor in the king's feasting and in his show as well, in his show of wealth. By the time this book is written, the results of the war with Greece were well known. He was resisted and turned back by the legendary 300 Spartans. Now, how embarrassing for a kingdom with many supporting armies to lose to 300 men. A very large sum of the wealth he displayed at the beginning of a story was lost in this war. Next, when the king summons his queen, he sends 7 eunuchs to go get her. At this point, it seems only 9 people know of her refusal, the king and queen and the 7 eunuchs. The king then consults his advisors, and the number who know of her rebuttal now grows to 16. The advice of the advisors is to proclaim to the whole kingdom, proclaim to the whole kingdom that she refused him, and now the whole kingdom knows. It's also a little humorous to think that a royal declaration is all that is needed to get the woman to fall in line. So in the end, the king's insecurities took an embarrassing private moment and announced his failure to the whole kingdom. Finally, I will point out that we will see that the highest authority in the largest kingdom that the earth has ever seen is unable to make a ruling by himself. Only once in this book does he decide the next course of action. Every other decision is highly influenced by his advisors and their insecurities. So we have to ask, who really is in charge here? The best our authoritarian king can do is ask, well, now what do I do? Now, I get it, I know the jokes aren't as funny when they have to be explained, but the Jews do consider this book as a comedy. Another important feature of this book is the concept of providence. Providence is the working of God through the actions of men. Again, there's no mention of God in this book. There's nothing about the land, the exile, the temple. All the important features and distinguishing marks of Judaism are missing in this book. This is very important. We will continue to see more evidence as we advance our study. And I'm sure if I asked many people here today, most would confirm that God has worked in their lives. Most people would also confirm that they did not recognize it until after the fact. Upon reflection, God's work looked a lot like everyday life. So also in Esther, we will see that there is no commentary on people's actions. For example, Queen Vashti's refusal is ambiguous. We do not know why she refused. It's very easy to read our interpretation of events into the story. Was she being defiant? Was she tired of being treated like an object of the king's desire? Now, given the dates at the start of this book, it's possible she's pregnant with Artaxerxes, the next in line for the throne. Perhaps her water just broke, and she can't come. Now, this would seem like a legitimate reason to refuse her summons. We simply do not know. This serves to separate the actions of men from the actions of God. For the purposes of this book, men's morality is irrelevant. It emphasizes that God does what he will do regardless of men's action. Whatever the reason was, somehow God directed or used the actions of men and women to see this story to his end and purpose. He is able to respect free will and direct history to the final end of the salvation of the world. So we'll keep revisiting this idea of providence, and we'll see some more of the humor as well. So at this point, I'll give you a table talk. Have you ever had an experience that looked like everyday life, and then sometime later realized that it was God's hand moving you in a certain direction? Was it a good experience? Perhaps it was a negative experience, but it turned out to be positive or helpful to your life. So go ahead and discuss that amongst yourselves. Let's start with chapter 2 now. And it starts off here. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it, I guess. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge over the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. Esther had not revealed her nationality because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. When the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday through the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, but Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. So this chapter starts with a plan for replacing the defiant queen. As the story is told, we are introduced to Mordecai and Esther. Now Mordecai is a random Jewish man, and we get very little information about him. We do not know his occupation or his status in society, and how he even got involved in the story. We do know some of his family background. Now I've recently discovered that there are often parts of biblical stories that echo previous stories. These repetitive details are a brilliant way to give us details without actually giving us the details. So one such echo is the family details of Mordecai. He is a Benjamite and a great-grandson of Kish. Now as we did our study on Samuel last year, Saul became a major character in the story. He was a Benjamite, and his father's name was Kish. Now this is a vital piece of information that ties this book into the canon of the Old Testament, but I'll explain more next week. Next we meet Esther. She's an orphan, taken in by her cousin Mordecai. I will assume that there's a sizable age difference, since the story tells us that he treated her as his own daughter. Now life takes an interesting turn for her. Now there are not many tactful ways to say this, but she's very beautiful, and she enters a contest where the winner is determined by her performance on a one-night stand with the king of Persia. Now this is another example where many details are left out, and it helps and it aids the concept of providence. Now, was she a willing participant? I mean, those who didn't succeed were sent to the harem, where they would spend the rest of their lives in relative comfort. Not ideal, but one may prefer it to a life of poverty outside the tents of the harem. Did she choose to be there? Was she forced to be there? We don't know. Did Mordecai play a role in her participation? Sure hope not. She was his daughter, after all. These details are left out, so we cannot judge her motives. Everything is wrong about it. The book of the law tells the Jews not to marry someone who is not from the people of God. At the very least, she must have known that fornication was worthy of capital punishment. Yet here she is, trying to get the attention of the king. It's very tempting for us to judge her actions, but to do so is speculation on our part. This lack of comment emphasizes God's providence. He does what he thinks is needed for the salvation of the world, regardless of our obedience or disobedience. So we've got a bit more to read here in chapter 2. We'll end it up here. So during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorways, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on a pole. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So chapter 2 ends with another vital piece of information in our story. Mordecai overhears of an assassination plot to kill the king. The two conspirators are among the 7 closest advisors to the king that we read about earlier. Mordecai reports it to Esther, who reports it to the king, and the king's CSI unit investigates and finds out that it's true. And immediately the two are killed. Now this could have never happened had Esther not entered the contest. This could not have happened if Esther had not won the contest. Everyday life has just changed the course of history. So as I wrap up today, I want to comment about Xerxes. Now, this was an odd thing for me to say or to think about, but I am seeing in this story Xerxes as a type of Christ, albeit imperfect one, as are all the types of Christ in the Old Testament. Now, when I identify a type of Christ in the Old Testament, I'm speaking of the little clues that tells us of the nature of Christ. It is like the parables in the New Testament and gives us pictures of the kingdom of God. So this is what I see. Xerxes is the highest ruler in the land. He has a chosen queen, and when he tries to show off her beauty for the world to see, she refuses him. As a result, Vashti is rejected and finds herself outside the influence of the king. Israel was God's chosen people, and they broke their covenant over and over again. They were not rejected by God, but they did have their hearts hardened, and the throne room, they did have their hearts hardened, and still today live outside of God's covenant. Now, as a result of this hardened heart, the throne room was opened up to a foreign, orphaned woman who went through a period of refinement and beautification and ended up with the royal title of queen. Now, I love this picture of our sanctification. This is the preparation we all receive here on earth as we wait to be united with Him at the end of time. Now, Rebecca talked about this last week in Romans. It's not always easy, but He loves us way too much to leave us in our sinful ways. Ephesians 2:10 tells us that we are His masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus for good works which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Now this isn't just putting lipstick on a pig. You and I are a masterpiece of the ultimate Creator. As a result, we have a purpose and a task before us. This task will be discussed in week 4. Sorry to make you wait, but believe me, it's a good one. We have a lot more details to develop here, but we need to read more of the story to get a picture of these details. So I'm going to leave us here. It's a little abrupt, I know, but we'll get to the point soon enough. But as we go, I have one more table talk question for you. Let's discuss the idea of sanctification. This is where God refines us to be more like Him. Do you see trials as beautification? Last week we saw that trials led to glory. Do you see the greater picture of being created for good works? So discuss that amongst yourselves, pray for each other. Have a good week. We'll see you next week.